Okay, good morning. This is Richard Hsu, host of Hsu Untied. This morning, I'm really thrilled and excited to have with us my guest, Professor Ethan Kross, who's a professor of psychology and management at the University of Michigan, and also now the national best-selling author of the book Chatter. Ethan, welcome to the program.
Thanks for having me, Richard. Really excited to be here.
So, Ethan, why don't we start by describing, what it is your area of research is. What answer do you give when you're at a cocktail party when people ask you what it is you do?
Well, I study how people can manage their emotions, and I think of this as one of the big puzzles of human nature that we've been struggling with probably since the dawn of our species. This is a biblical problem. And what we try to do in my lab is, on the one hand, we try to find tools that exist that can help people manage their emotions if they want to. And then we also try to think about how do we use the information that we discover to actually help people out in the world. So we try to translate our knowledge to help society.
And is this both in business and in a personal context, or are you mostly focused on?
Absolutely. It is in life. So, one of the interesting things about studying this topic is emotions are relevant to everyone, no matter what domain they're operating in. And so what we're looking to do is generate fundamental insights about how emotions work and how they can be managed that can be used to help people, whether they're struggling with their emotions at work, at home, with their families, and so forth and so on. When I first started talking to folks about writing a book on a subset of issues in this big topic, one of the first pieces of advice people gave me was to say, never claim that the stuff you're writing about is relevant to everyone. You've got to define your market. And my response as kind of an earnest academic was just, but it is relevant to everyone. I can't get over that. It is. We all struggle at times with anger, sadness, anxiety, with this voice in our head. And so, so it's been fun to talk to folks from a lot of different industries about that work.
Interesting. So now, how did you stumble onto this area? Like, was it a personal realization, or how did you get into this area of research?
Well, it was a combination of personal stuff and academic. I'll give you the brief timeline here. So I'm a 3-year-old kid. I'm living in blue collar Brooklyn, New York with my family, my parents, and I've got an unconventional dad who, around the time I'm 3, starts telling me whenever I have a difficulty or a problem, he's not saying take a time out. He's saying go inside and try to find the solution to your problems. So he's encouraging me to introspect as a route to managing my frustrations from a very young age. And that was a lesson he taught me repeatedly growing up, and it's one that I came to rely on throughout my childhood and adolescence. Things would happen that were unexpected, not always pleasant, and I would pause, turn my attention inward, try to understand why this happened, acknowledge the experience, and then come up with a solution to move on. And I never really got stuck. I was always really quite good at moving on. Then I got to college. I took my first psychology class, and halfway through the semester, we got to the topic of introspection. And in my mind, I basically like rolled up my sleeves, cracked my knuckles. I've got this. I don't have to study this. I've been thinking about this stuff for ages. And what I learned there was, on the one hand, this capacity to turn our attention inward and use our mind and often language to solve problems. This is one of the defining features of human innovation, right? This is what allows us to do remarkable things like build spaceships that blast us up into outer space and discover vaccines and the internet and so forth and so on. But it was also, and this was new to me, I also learned that it was an enormous source of suffering for countless people who, when they experience difficulty, they would try to use this tool of the mind, but it would jam up on them. They would get stuck. They'd start ruminating about things or worrying or catastrophizing, getting stuck in these negative thought loops that I call chatter. And so to me, that became a giant puzzle. The puzzle being, we have this tool. It's amazingly useful. You don't want to live without it. But on the other hand, it's really unwieldy. And so I became just totally mystified with why this is the case, and really motivated to learn how to use the tools of science to try to solve this puzzle, to figure out how to help people master this capacity to introspect. And I went to graduate school to do that, and I've been doing it ever since.
So what are some of the keys to unpacking the shackles of chatter? Because I mean, we can all relate to that. I can certainly relate to that. I just recently interviewed Amy Gallo, and she's doing some stuff in this similar areas. I'm sure you know. What is, start to unpack that for me a little bit.
Well, the first thing to keep in mind is that there's no single tool to I like the way you phrased it, to unlock the shackle of the mind, right? There's no, I think you should be really weary if people say, here's the one thing that you should do and everyone should do this and they'll be better. I've been doing research in this space for a long time. Doesn't exist. What does exist is arguably even more exciting from my perspective. There are dozens of tools out there, science-based tools, ways in which we as a species have evolved tools, compensatory mechanisms to manage our mind when it runs awry, or these conversations that we often have with ourselves, the ruminations and worry. And so I like to divide the world of tools into three categories: things you can use on your own, tools you can use on your own, people tools, ways of harnessing our relationships, and then environmental tools, ways of interacting with our physical spaces. And I'll give you a couple examples. So when it comes to things you can do on your own, one of the really problematic features of what I call chatter, getting stuck in those negative thought loops, we zoom in really narrowly on the problem. All we could think about is this issue at hand, and we're trying to work through it, but we're just rehearsing the negativity, whether it be about the past, the future, or the present. What we've learned is that the ability to step back and broaden our perspective so that we can weigh in on that experience more objectively is a really useful antidote to that kind of state. And there are many ways of doing this. We call this getting some psychological distance from the experience. One tool that I personally, this is my first line of defense against chatter, we've studied this in my lab, we call it distanced self-talk. And what it involves doing is leveraging the structure of language to shift your perspective and get you to give advice to yourself like you would give advice to another human being. One of the things we've learned over the years is that we are much better at giving advice to others, at reasoning wisely about other people's problems than we are reasoning about our own problems. There's a name for this phenomenon. We call it Solomon's paradox. It's named after the Bible's King Solomon, who was world and historically renowned for being a sage leader. But when if you dig into his life, what you quickly learn is he made a rash of terrible decisions. He got involved in these love triangles and pentagons, like lots of women, and it ultimately contributed to his kingdom's demise. So we can advise others really well, but not really ourselves. Here's how distant self-talk works. You use your name or the second person pronoun you to coach yourself through a problem. So if I'm really struggling with an incident with a colleague, which may or not actually be the case right now, I can think to myself, all right, Ethan, how are you going to manage this situation? Why do you think they did this? And so rather than thinking about it, I, me, my, I'm using parts of speech, names, and words like you, which are words we almost exclusively use when we think about and refer to another person. So the link in your mind between using these parts of speech and thinking about other people is super tight. So when you use your name to think about yourself, it essentially turns on the mental machinery for thinking about others. And that makes it much easier for us to be wiser as we navigate our problems. So that's one thing you could do. Super simple, super easy to do. Another distancing tool is something I call temporal distancing or mental time travel. I sometimes refer to this as my 2 a.m. chatter strategy. What I mean by that, and I'd be curious, Richard, if this is true of you, every few weeks I will wake up at 2 a.m. It's unpredictable. When it happens, what happens when it does happen, it is very predictable. Eyes wide open, and it starts as something bad happens at work or at home. I lose my job or my family. I'm in jail, and I'm dead, like all within 7 seconds. Very, very problematic and not fun. Keeps you up. So what do I do when that kind of thing happens? Something very simple. I jump into the mental time travel machine that we all possess, and I think to myself, Ethan, actually use my name, how are you going to feel about this tomorrow morning? No matter how bad the chatter is at 2 a.m., I can under oath swear that it is always better the next morning when my brain is fully activated and I have full cognitive capacity. Sometimes I'll go even further in time. I'll think, how are you going to feel about this next month or next year or in 10 years? What I'm doing there is I'm broadening the perspective. Rather than being zoomed in on the seeming catastrophe, I'm looking at that bigger picture, and that often has solutions. You can go back in time too. If I'm really nervous about an engagement, it's a huge speaking engagement, thousands of people. Oh my God, what if, they don't like this? I go back in time. Ethan, actually, you've given hundreds of presentations. They've always been well received. Why would this be? So there again, I'm expanding things. One lesson, beyond this strategy that I would love listeners to take away with this has to do with this concept of being in the moment, which is incredibly popular in popular culture. Everything that I'm talking about involves doing the opposite of focusing on the now. It actually involves focusing on the future and the past. Focusing on the present and being in the moment can be very effective in certain contexts, but I love to remind people that it is one tool. You would not want to live a life in which you are always focused on the present. There are animals that live lives like that. They often have multiple legs and antennae, right? They don't have this capacity to transport themselves in time. That capacity, if harnessed properly, can be an amazing tool, and mental time travel is one example of that. So those are two tools that you could use on your own. You want me? Should I keep going?
Well, let me first of all, this is super helpful for context. I mean, I'm sort of familiar with this because I've also studied meditation. Of course,
Sure.
I know that's one of the and you just touched on one of them, the present moment. One of the features I find very interesting, because I've also thought about this a lot, about chatter, is how much your brain, and again, I'd love to hear, maybe there's an evolutionary reason for this, why the brain also needs to repeat itself so much. Like, you already know, say something bad happens to you. And okay, I already know it's bad. So, but why does the brain need to keep telling me over and over and over again? And I've heard this point numerous times, and I've also observed this, is that, and I'm saying something that I've heard from somebody else, but it's like if you were, if I enunciated everything that my brain was saying about something, I would sound like a crazy person, right? I would just be repeating myself over and over and over and over again.
Yes.
And that's the interesting thing. It's like, I already know this bad thing happened. Why do I need to keep telling myself, how bad it was?
It's a wonderful question, and I have an answer.
Perfect.
So that's good. I don't always have answers to wonderful questions. So you could think of your brain as the most remarkable problem-solving machine that we know of in the universe. And like at a very basic level, the way this brain of yours works is it's doing lots of stuff behind the scenes at all times, including when you're sleeping, to just kind of keep you functioning and humming along. A lot of what we do is on autopilot, right? Like in an ideal world, we're conserving our energy and resources so that we have them when we need them. Then we experience a problem. Maybe it's a fight with a colleague or a partner, whatever. You fill in the gaps about whatever you experience chatter about. Now, all of a sudden, we detect this problem and we instantly mobilize these remarkable resources that we possess to solve it. Now, a lot of the time, I would argue, that process works really, really well. Things happen, we come up with a solution, we move on. Like we don't notice when it's running really well. But sometimes, particularly when it's a really emotional experience, this process, this chain of events, it jams up. So now you have this situation in which you've detected that the problem exists, and you're bringing tools to bear on it, but the tools aren't working. It's kind of like you're using a screwdriver sometimes to bang in a nail. You still detect that the problem exists, though, so you're still very, very motivated to solve it. And so unless we step back or make a commitment ahead of time to be smart about how we engage with this problem, we keep on trying to use that same tool that has served us so well so many times in our lives. We don't pivot, we don't shift, and that's when we get into big trouble.
Well, it seems like a pretty good solution. How do you go about studying this scientifically? Because I mean, or it just seems like it's very difficult to quantify or qualify even. I mean, how
Yeah.
do you go about doing that, and how do you do research, and
Yeah.
how do
I,
you set studies up?
I thank you for asking that question, because usually when I talk about these tools, we talked about two, there are close to like 30 out there. A lot of these things are really simple to do. Use your name to work through a problem. How are you going to feel tomorrow morning? Or,
Mm.
perform a ritual. The take homes are really often simple, which I think is useful for having impact. But there's enormous complexity that has gone into the identification of these tools. This complexion of my hair is directly correlated with the complexity. So in my lab, and this is true of the field more generally, we take a multi-method approach. We try to look at these tools and how they operate from lots of different levels of analysis. So in some studies, we might, for example, put people in an MRI machine and have them think about really painful emotional experiences that provoke chatter, and then instruct them to think about those experiences in different ways. Use your name, distant self-talk to work through a problem versus I. We might bring people in, and we have brought people into our laboratory and created these really emotional contexts to stress people out, like telling people they have to give a speech on a topic that they haven't prepared for, giving them zero time to prepare, and then making them do it in front of a panel of Confederates. And we instruct people to use different tools before and after, and then see how that impacts their recovery, both subjectively, but also physiologically. So how quickly does their blood pressure or heart rate return to baseline? We look at people's performance as a function of these different kinds of tools. We'll also do experiments where we make use of these handy devices, these smartphones. This is not, I'm sorry to Apple, not an advertisement there. We basically use a methodology called experience sampling, which involves text messaging people throughout the day over the course of several days, really short surveys. So, like every 2 hours on average, we might text message a person and ask them to complete 5 or 6 questions that ask them, are they experiencing chatter about something? What did they do to deal with it? How are they feeling? And the beauty of that methodology is it allows us to understand how these different tools are impacting people as they actually live their lives. And not only how do they impact people in the moment, but how does using a tool at 9 a.m. impact the way they feel at 11 a.m. or 3 p.m. or the next day? So those are a couple of examples. We do some big intervention studies with schools as well. We really try to look at these phenomena from as many different angles as possible, using as many different tools as possible to develop converging evidence for what we're trying to look at.
Have you come to any conclusions about, because everybody, some people, the chatter is just so crushingly, I mean, it can be like a runaway freight train. I mean, they literally are buckling underneath the chatter. And then other people, it doesn't bother them that much. What have you kind of concluded about the range of reaction that people have to this problem?
I think it's it's always, you have to be careful when talking about universality of experiences, but I think this is pretty close. I have yet to meet someone who has not had an experience of chatter of some degree. There's enormous variability in the extent to which people experience high or low levels of chatter chronically, meaning some people who are always at the high or low point. But there's also variability within a person's lives. And so I might be someone who's relatively low level in terms of chatter, and this is actually pretty true of me. And I really do believe the reason for that is I use the kinds of tools I'm talking about. Like I'm really good at detecting when the chatter is beginning to brew and then implementing tools to bring it down. But there are moments where I'll experience a spike and have to go beyond the 2 or 3 tools I might use to use 6 or 7 of the more heavy-handed ones. So there's real variability, and at the extreme end, chatter is a feature of different kinds of mental disorders. Like a common feature that characterizes various mood disorders like anxiety and depression is this tendency to perseverate on things.
Yeah,
That
right.
would be the most extreme manifestation of chatter.
For sure.
But the space that I've worked mostly and that my book is about has to do more with the everyday problems of living that are endemic to human life. I mean, if there's one message I hope people take away from the book, it is that if you experience chatter, welcome to the human condition, my friend. We all do at times. And I think just recognizing that is crucially important to taking the next step to figure out how to manage it.
Is that a term you invented, the word chatter, or?
Well, it's not a word I invented, but I certainly
Right.
did link it with this phenomenon. And let me tell you why. Scientists, myself included, we are really good at coming up with lots of different names to refer to practically the same exact phenomenon.
Yes.
And so if you look at the literature in the space, you'll come across terms like rumination, worry, perseverative cognition, anxiety, and the list, just overthinking, the list keeps going on, catastrophization. And so chatter to me is a term that really captures the phenomenological experience of this monkey mind. That's another term, just this kind of thought looping that we often experience.
Yeah. Well, let's talk a little bit about how your research and your work kind of touches upon meditation and mindfulness, because obviously you mentioned it before, and obviously that is a popular thing. I've tried that before to try to cut down on the chatter. I kind of mentioned to you, get away from your thoughts and just realize these are your thoughts. Tell me a little bit about where maybe, you and meditation, or give me an idea of the intersection of you and meditation.
I'll give you a little personal aside on meditation. So I've been meditating on and off since the time I'm 5 years old.
Okay.
When I turned 5, this unconventional dad that I had, I really wanted a bicycle for my birthday, and he gave me a mantra instead. So that was a kind of flashbulb experience early in life. I think meditation is great, and I think it is one tool that exists for managing chatter. I think it's really important to emphasize that, because in the way culture often works is we get swept up with one idea, and then we embrace it as a one-size-fits-all solution. I do not think meditation is a one-size-fits-all solution. I don't think any such solutions exist for chatter, but it is certainly a method you want to have in your arsenal for dealing with it. In terms of overlap between meditation and some of the other tools that we know about, there is some, but there are also some differences. Meditation tends to be more effortful than a lot of the tools that I talk about, though tools vary in effortfulness, and that's fine. Sometimes we have time to meditate, and that can be great. At other times we need to do something on the fly, and maybe distant self-talk is better in that context. The notion of distancing factors heavily into meditation, this idea that you can step back and observe your thoughts. Some research suggests that it's one of the key active ingredients that explains how meditation works. And one of the ways in which meditation teaches people to distance is through a mantra or focusing on breath, because what any novice meditator quickly learns is that it's really hard to stay focused on a mantra or breath. And so you eventually have this experience of being able to observe yourself having that difficulty. But there are some differences too. A lot of forms of meditation, promote acceptance and not engaging with thoughts or elaborating on them. So just recognize that you're experiencing anger, and that the anger isn't you. It's like you're the school bus and the anger's a passenger. Passengers can come on the bus, but they also get off. Let it go. Don't engage. And I think there's a time and place for that non-engagement, but there are also times in which we want to be able to engage, analyze, think critically about difficult moments in our lives, and that we can do so with a healthy distance. And I think that is somewhat antithetical to some kinds of meditation. So it's all part of the family, but there are important nuances. And I think the smarter we get, and by smarter I don't mean like raw IQ, I mean the more we familiarize ourselves with the different tools that are out there and how they work, that can be really empowering, because then it's like almost like my grandfather was a carpenter. I didn't get any of his technical skills when it comes to manual labor. However, I remember he had this amazing set of tools, and he knew exactly which one to use when. And we are so far behind, I think, right now as a culture in terms of just getting people the tools, let alone teaching them where they work and how to use them. But that's the hope here.
Well, the obsessiveness and the compulsion that arises from the chatter is pretty uncanny. And as I said, when I interviewed Amy Gallo, she talked about how, her experience, she'd have like a perfectly good meeting, a great meeting. And then, one comment in that meeting, and all of a sudden the person just obsesses about that for the entire day, has forgotten everything that was even said in that meeting.
Yeah.
It was a tiny little comment, but somehow they felt insulted or slighted or whatever. But their entire focus, their entire things, their thoughts, whatever, is just around that one thing. So it's a classic
Yeah, well,
example.
so that makes me think of course, that's true, and I would argue that's true for most of us. It reminds me of one of my favorite findings in psychology, and when I think of psychology's greatest hits, a Hall of Fame finding, which is this idea that bad is much stronger than good. We
Yeah,
have very
right.
few Nobel Prizes that psychologists have won. Danny Kahneman is one of those individuals. And his Nobel Prize was for the discovery of loss aversion, this idea that we're more sensitive to losses than we are to gains.
Yeah,
There's an evolutionary argument for this, right? That threats are like bad things are more threatening to our survival than the good stuff. So I think knowing how that works, that in and of itself can be liberating, and it can also guide you to engage in efforts to combat that tendency. So I get evaluations from students every semester I teach. Inevitably, there'll be, like, let's say there are 300 evaluations.
yeah.
298 will be glowing. 2 will be a little negative. And it's like I used to be with a cold compress on my head on the couch. Oh my God, how could they say this? I put so much time in this. I love them. I love it. And just knowing how this works, actually, it obviates the need for the cold compress. So hopefully, like, knowledge is power there.
What is your experience with this chatter phenomenon with children and young teens as they go into adults? I mean, is this something that,
Oh yeah.
tell me a little bit about that and your experience with trying to educate even younger people about this.
Well, we have a massive project that we're finally analyzing the data for, that is aimed to get kids these tools. It's called the Michigan Skills Project. And we went into an entire school district in rural Georgia, not rural Georgia, I should say, but in between suburban and rural. And we basically developed a curriculum that teaches kids in high school, all grades in high school, about what we're talking about today, the science of self-control, effectively. And we also developed a companion curriculum, as a control group. And I think it's 14 lessons. And what we're trying to do is, number one, see, can teaching kids about these tools, do they learn the information? Like, that's really important. And that's one of our primary goals. We could check that box. The preliminary analyses we've done showed pretty significant gains in knowledge as a function of having kids go through these curricula. But then the second question is, well, what implications does it have for kids as they live their lives? And that might be something that we detect long term. One of the reasons for doing this project was I was teaching a class at Michigan, a senior seminar on this topic. And during the final class of the semester, a student named Ariel asked me a question pointedly: why are we learning about this now? And I didn't know what she was talking about. And she went on to elaborate, why didn't anyone teach us about this stuff earlier when it could have made a difference in our lives? And so that's really what this project is designed to do. So we'll hopefully have the full data set completely analyzed very soon. But for folks, parents who are listening, or kids, there's nothing stopping people from educating themselves about how all of this works now. And I just think it's in some ways a flaw that the educational system, that we haven't done a better job teaching this stuff earlier on. Like, I joke that I remember learning about taking classes in biology in junior high school and high school. And in both of those classes, for some reason, it's interesting the things that you remember. I remember learning about the digestive system, and in particular, the process of peristalsis, which explains how you squeeze food from one hole or orifice to another. if you ask me how many occasions in my adult life I've had to use that knowledge, aside from a conversation like this, I can answer that pretty confidently. There have been 2 times. Don't worry, it's not gory. Each of my daughters independently asked me, Daddy, how do you swallow food when you're upside down? I could tell you about peristalsis, right? 2 times. Ask me how many times I've had occasion to manage chatter and the emotions it elicits. I think for many people, it's a constant struggle. So why aren't we teaching people about how the human mind works in that regards earlier on? That to me is a huge issue.
I kind of discovered it when I actually read The Power of Now, which I'm sure you've read, Eckhart Tolle's, and that first realization where, you are not your thoughts, or you can actually be separate from your thoughts. I mean, that simple concept was just mind-blowing, because up to that point, you think you are your thoughts. You are only your thoughts, but the realization that you can actually be separate from your thoughts, wow, that was just, I mean, that was a life-changing moment. I remember that, as you said, to this day.
There are these little shifts in how we think about things that can really impact the way we experience this world. And I think a lot of the tools, for me, as I've studied them and learned about them and researched them, they've had that kind of impact. Like, there's actually a historical record of people talking to themselves in the third person when they're stressed out. Julius Caesar did this, Salvador Dali, LeBron James, and lots of other contemporary figures. I would argue that most of those people, none of them were explicitly told, hey, when you're struggling, use your name. They stumbled on that tool. But now that we know how it works, we could be proactive. Like, I know that I could use my name to work through a problem. I know that I can organize my office if I'm stressed out, and that's going to make me feel better, because it's going to compensate for the lack of order I feel in my mind by exerting control around me. Like, I never knew that. That was a mind blower to me, and many other things along those lines. So that the upshot of all this is that this science is not only important, I think, for helping improve people's lives, but it's also really fun to research and do studies on.
What is your experience, or do you have any generalizations you can make about the effectivity of the tools in the personal realm versus in the business context? I mean, obviously we get chatter in both contexts. They're different. What is your experience with that?
Well, the first thing I would say is they spill over into one another quite regularly. Arguments that you have with your partner don't stay at home if you've had the fight right before you go to work. And likewise, the difficulties you're experiencing at work can spill over into the home. So I think we have to think about these domains as overlapping, like if we're talking about a Venn diagram. There have not been enough systematic comparisons of how each of the 27 tools I talk about work in each of these different domains. So I want to give you that caveat as a scientist. Having said that, there's a lot of work showing efficacy across domains. Like take one example. One thing we haven't talked about yet is, how do you leverage relationships with other people to actually help you manage chatter? And it's actually a really important question, because we know from decades of research that when people experience the kinds of strong emotions that characterize chatter, they are intensely motivated to go to other people to get support. There are a couple of exceptions to that rule. We tend not to want to talk about experiences of shame or embarrassment, but the whole other universe, we often like to unload. Well, it turns out a lot of research has looked at does the way you talk to someone make a difference? And indeed it does. Simply venting your emotion, so just finding someone to express what you're feeling to, that can be really good for strengthening the relational bonds between people, but it's not helpful for allowing a person to work through their problems, because all you're doing is rehashing the negativity. And if I'm talking to you, Richard, you're now a supportive other, so you're, oh, that sounds terrible. Yeah, you were right to feel that way. What else happened? Like, enormous compassion. I feel great about our relationship. But I leave the conversation, the problem is still active. I haven't dealt with it. And we've seen that across different domains, organizational and non-organizational. Just to close the loop on that, by no means am I saying you shouldn't talk to other people. There is a way of getting good chatter support what it involves doing is talking to people who do two things. First, they take the time to listen and hear you out. That is critically important. But then they additionally, once the person they're talking to feels heard, and sometimes it's not clear when that is, you can ask them, but once they are, then they start working with that person to help them problem solve. So they might, how do you think you should deal with it? Or I've been in this situation, here's what I did. Or, big picture, I think this is the solution. So shifting from the emotional to the cognitive support, that is the two-step process that characterizes good chatter advisors. And the take home, I think, for people is really clear. Think really carefully about who you talk to. Do they help you do both of those things? Or do they only keep you ruminating and venting? I've posed that question to many audiences, and consistently what I hear is a lot of us, we actually just go to share our chatter with people who don't help us work through it. And that can be harmful to us. So that's just one example of something that has been looked at in both contexts.
Do you also do training for people on how to be better to help people with chatter? I mean, it sounds like that's also another learning thing. Like when someone comes to you with a problem or they're talking about it, how do you?
Absolutely. So there are two sides to what I just described, and I talk about this in the book, and we do workshops on this content. This is about being knowing how to get good chatter support, but also how to be a good chatter advisor to others.
Yeah, right.
And when you're being a good chatter advisor to others, like the hope is I've just given listeners a blueprint for how to do that. No one teaches us that, right? Unless you go to, get trained as a clinical psychologist or counselor. That's not what we're talking about here. You don't have to go to a therapist for every episode of chatter. It's a two-step process that you want to be flexible as you navigate. And like, I know that when people call me for support, I know what I'm going to listen earnestly, compassionately. Yeah. And then when I see my opening, I'm going to start trying to help them look at that bigger picture. And if it's not clear, I'll ask them. So if my wife comes to me with a problem, I'll let her go talk about it. And then if I think I see my opening, but I'm not sure. So I'll say, I totally get it. It sounds awful. I have an idea. Can I share it with you? And sometimes she'll just look at me very sternly. No, just keep listening. And then I listen, and then we try again. Other times she'll say, please tell me, what do you think? So there's an art to it. The other piece to all of this that I'll just put out there really quick is everything I've just described has to do with instances in which people actually come to you and ask for your help. There's a whole universe of situations, both at work and at home, where you see other people you care about struggling with chatter, but they don't ask you for help. And then the question is, well, what do you do? The research says that you should be careful if you volunteer the support when it's not asked for, because what that can do is threaten the person's sense of autonomy and agency, this idea that we're capable of managing our own circumstances. And so instead, as a first step, what the research advocates doing is something called providing invisible support. And what this involves is getting people the resources and help they need, but without shining a spotlight on the fact that you're doing that. And there are many forms that this can take, ranging from super, super simple. So if my wife is overwhelmed with chatter and lots of work, I can do little things to make her life easier. I could take care of dinner and all the kids' stuff that day if that was her turn to do it. I do those things. I don't ask for credit. I'm not giving her a receipt when I'm done. I just do them. And that makes her burden a little bit easier. If someone in my lab is really struggling with their writing skills, rather than really singling them out and say, you need to up your game, as a first step, I might have a team meeting where we share out common best practices. And what I'm doing there is I'm getting the person vital information. It's getting in their head, but I'm not saying, hey, you need to do this. Or when it comes to home and my kids, if they're dealing with chatter, sometimes I'll do something as simple, and this is going to sound corny, but there's lots of research to back it up. I'll give them a hug, and I'll pat them on the back, and I'll hold their hand. That's called affectionate touch, and affectionate touch is one of the most basic tools we possess for regulating other people's emotions. It is the first thing we do when a child is born into this world. Skin-to-skin contact. It's true of adults too. There's research which shows that an affectionate embrace, if it is wanted, so there's some caveats for the workplace, of course, but an affectionate embrace, it releases a cascade of stress-fighting chemicals, and it reminds us at a conscious level that there are people out there in this world that, as shitty as the circumstances may be, really care about us, and that is helpful too.
That doesn't sound corny at all. Actually, I was just getting goosebumps when you said that, so I can totally relate to that. It sounds awesome. Have you had a chance to circle back with your dad with all, I mean, what does he say about all this, that, because he kind of inspired you with that, be introspective when you're 5 years old. But what does he think about how this has all come full circle?
He finds it really interesting. And he's really a meditation devotee, so that's where his allegiances lie. So he has some favorite tools, and we kind of go at it a little bit about whether it's better to have a broad toolbox or do one thing. But my dad never got a degree in college. He was like just an amateur philosopher / religious studies scholar. He just loved reading about that kind of stuff in his spare time. So he just kind of loves thinking and talking in this space, which is a pretty unique experience to have had growing up, given his background. So.
Well, and I think it's cool how, that little thing that he did kind of, ended up inspiring you to, actually make this your full-blown, career and profession.
Well, and I can tell you as a parent now, I'm super mindful of how the things we say to our kids, regardless of whether they appear to be listening or not, they have a way of getting into their consciousness. And so I'm really mindful about that, and some probably more deliberate than maybe some at talking to them in particular ways about things. But I can tell you certainly like moments of personal victory. Like I talk to my kids about the kind of stuff we do in the lab, in general terms, and most of the time it's met with eye rolls and Mom, can you please tell them to talk about something else? And I keep doing it. I lay off a little bit, come back. But then I fast forward and like one of my daughters started diving last summer, which is actually really prone to experiencing chatter because you're waiting a huge amount of time. And then it's all on you. You're on the board. Everyone's looking at you. So it's a very slow sport in many ways. And I asked her, like, so what do you do like when you're waiting? And she rattled off like 6 of the tools that I've talked to her about. I had no idea, and I couldn't help but smile.
Well, this is a perfect time for a great story about the 3 stages of life. The first stage is when your kid says, "My dad can beat up your dad." The second stage is when the kid says, "Aw, Dad." And the third stage is, "My father used to say."
Very, very. What stage are you in right now? It is. I'm definitely in stage 2 still. So I'd like to be in the next one.
Ethan, it has been so wonderful chatting with you. I love this conversation. It was so interesting. And I would love to follow your research when you write your next book or in a few years. I'd love for you to come back and chat with me and tell me what else you've discovered.
Well, it was an absolute joy. So thank you for inviting me on. I would love to do a part 2.
This is Richard Hsu and Ethan Kross. Thanks.